is chaos. Everything is bad, crazy, going every which way. And it's really important for us to understand that in the Hebrew mindset, in the Hebrew mentality, that creation is not just about making something out of nothing. But what creation entails is this idea of bringing order into chaos, creating beauty from ashes, creating good from chaotic. And so you go on through this narrative, and what we see this really cool thing that God does to bring order into the chaos. And what he does is, you look at day one. What did God create on day one? Light, right? So day one, he creates light. Day two, you remember what he created? If you got to sing the preschool song in your head, go ahead and do it. Day one, God made light when there was none. Day two, he makes the sky and the clouds. Day three, you remember what he made on day three? Some of you are singing it. I can see you doing it now. Dry land and vegetation. Okay? So you got the first 3 days. Then you go to day 4, 5, and 6. And notice what God does on day 4. What did God make on day 4? Sun, moon, and stars. Day 1, he made the light. Day 4, he made the sun, moon, and stars. Day 2, he made the sky and the seas. Day 5, he made the birds and the fish. Day 3, he makes dry ground and vegetation. Day 6, he makes the creatures that live on the ground and need the food from the vegetation. So what God does is he brings order into chaos by creating these environments, these habitats, if you will, and then filling them. And then after he does that, he creates the pinnacle of creation, which is humanity, man and woman. Genesis 1:27-28 says, it said, let us make humanity in our own image and in our likeness. And so God does that. He creates humanity as kind of the pinnacle of it. And then when you get to the end of that creation account, or that first part of the creation account in the first couple of verses of chapter 2, it says that God rested because everything was complete. So what he's done is he's taken chaos and brought order into it, and that is representative of who God is, and that is representative of what God gave us, being made in his image, as what is natural for us. It's what we seek. Even when we don't realize it, what we're seeking is peace. Okay? So when conflict happens in a relationship, what's going on is there's something that has disrupted the peace that God intends to be there. That makes sense? Okay? And when you get all the way to the end of chapter 2, what happens? Chapter 1 is kind of like this view from 30,000 feet. Chapter 2 is like the zoom in, where it talks about the creation of humanity in the garden, and the 2 trees in the garden, and God's plan for humanity to partner with him in caring for creation, and how it talks about that God expects humanity to be, God's at the center. In chapter 2, we see this very clearly. God's at the center, and everything's about God and revolves around God. And the very last verse of chapter 2, I love this verse. It says, the man and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame. Now, while that might be a literal verse about Adam and Eve running around in the garden with no clothes on, I am 100% convinced that what the Genesis writer wants us to see is the metaphorical meaning here. And the metaphorical meaning is this. Adam and Eve, the man and the woman, were able to stand before each other completely revealed and accept each other for who they were. There was no conflict in paradise because they saw each other fully and they knew each other fully, and God was at the center of who they were and what their purpose was. Now, that is a great and wonderful thing, but we don't live in Genesis 1 and 2. We don't live in paradise. We live in chapter 3 and on, where their sin, their selfishness, their desire to take God off of his throne and put each of them individually up there, disrupts all that. And that's where conflict first happens. When sinfulness, selfishness comes into play. So, what do we do with that? We live in a fallen world. We live in a world that is characterized by brokenness. It's characterized by the chaos that God didn't intend for this world to be. And I believe with all my heart that we all long to go back to that idea of peace, unity, God at the center, things like they're supposed to be. Because we know, now some people understand, some people have grown up in such conflicted environments, either in their childhood or maybe in their marriage now or somewhere in their life, that they become used to the conflict and they don't know anything but the conflict. And so it's very hard for them to imagine anything else. But I believe with all my heart that God put within us a longing for that peace, for that completeness that comes in not living in this world in a chaotic way. So, let's start putting all that together and what that means about conflict in relationships now and what do we do with that. Genesis 1 and 2 represents safety. When God's at the center, when things are like they're supposed to be, the environment is safe. When you move to Genesis 3 and there's this brokenness and there's this selfishness and there's this blame and this anger and all these other things that are going on, that's not safe. And so to help us kind of understand this idea of safety, let me talk for just a second about brain science, because brain science is fun, right? God created us in a very special way. And the way that God created us is He created our brain in two layers. There's a lower layer and an upper layer. The upper layer is our long-term memory, it's our reasoning, it's our figuring things out, it's our planning, it's all those good rational kind of things, right? The lower layer, there's this little bitty part kind of in the middle, just above the top of the brain stem there, that's called the amygdala. And what the amygdala is our instinctive responses. That's your fight, flight, or freeze reaction. And the way that God created us is that when something happens that threatens our safety in some way, the amygdala fires off at least a millisecond before the upper brain does. And again, there's a reason for why God created us that way. Because if you are out in the woods hiking and you run across a cougar, you want to go, cougar, run away. You don't want the upper brain to kick in first with the logic and go, well, look, there's a cougar. Now, there's two paths back from here. Now, this path is shorter, but it's a little bit rougher. So should I take this path or should I take that longer path? By then you're cat chow, right? So God created us where that lower brain is meant to protect us, okay? What happens in conflict, in a marriage, in a relationship, is anytime that my safety is threatened, that lower brain's going to fire off first. Now, what threatens safety in a relationship? Well, obviously, if there's any kind of physical violence, that threatens your safety. Or if there is any kind of consistent verbal or emotional abuse, that threatens your safety. And that lower brain's going to kick off, and you are going to not feel safe, and you're going to retreat or react or do something because you don't feel safe. So what about in a marriage relationship that's not characterized by abusive behaviors? What triggers our conflict in that? What triggers our amygdala in that? Anytime you disrupt my status quo, you are going to trigger that lower part of my brain. Okay? Remember, we got the blinders. Anything that challenges those blinders and says, those need to expand a little, it's going to trigger that amygdala. Now, sometimes that response can be extreme, and sometimes that response can be very mild. But if you disrupt my comfort, what I know, what I like, what I'm comfortable with, you're going to trigger that lower brain, at least a little. If you disrupt my status quo in any way, you're going to trigger that, because I like to do things the way I like to do things because I'm right? Isn't that what we all think? And so that's how conflict happens. And again, the conflict can be big, the conflict can be small, but that's the common element in conflict in relationships, is somehow your safety's been challenged and that lower brain's been triggered. Now, when our lower brain gets triggered, and this is completely and totally nuts, what I'm about to tell you, but in a close, intimate relationship like marriage is supposed to be, very often, now not always, but very often when our lower brain gets triggered, what we want to do then is to immediately test the safety. And the way that we test safety a lot of times is by pushing back against the other person. Now, not physically, but by pushing back against them in some way. And what it's like, the best parallel that I have to this, it's like when you walk out on a frozen pond or a frozen lake. The way that you test the ice to see if the ice is going to hold you, what do? We stomp on it. Is there not something wrong with that in our brains? The thing that I'm doing to test to see if I'm safe is to try to break the safety. But that's what we do in relationships. I want to know that I'm safe with you. So I'm going to push you to make sure that I'm safe with you. If I'm not a nice person, are you still going to love me? If I challenge you in what you're thinking, are you still going to love me? If I push you, are you going to push back violently, or are you still going to love me? And so that's what we do. What we're looking for in conflict is to establish safety. We want to feel safe. And what gives us safety is having discernible, definable boundaries to this is safe, this is not. There was some research done several years ago about kids, school kids, playing on the playground. And it was really interesting because what they found is that in schoolyards where the playground had no fence around it, the kids were much more likely to stay very much huddled toward the center of the playground because they were concerned about their safety on a regular basis. But when there was a fence around the playground, they freely ran everywhere within the fenced-in area because they knew they were safe within the boundaries. And so what I recommend for every couple is to have an understanding of what makes your relationship safe and what makes it unsafe. Because what makes the relationship safe for you may be a little bit different than what makes it safe for your spouse. And if I act in a way that makes my wife feel unsafe, even if I'm perfectly fine with whatever I'm doing, then I need to back off from that. And so what I suggest that couples do is that they come up with what I call the ground rules. And when I'm talking about ground rules, what I'm talking about are some very simple kind of understandings between you about this is what makes me feel safe. Okay? And by the way, understand that some of you who've been married for a very long time, you're probably going, we got this one figured out. But I would challenge you to do this anyway, because I've known a lot of couples who've been married 30 and 40 years that wind up divorcing because one of them felt very unsafe the whole time, and they never vocalized that. So, what are the ground rules? Well, now you and your spouse have to figure out between the two of you what your ground rules are, but I want to give you some things that I think are very, very important things, at least to be thinking about in that direction. The first thing is listening. In conflict, our absolute first instinct is to defend, not to let in. And when you listen, you're letting somebody else in because you're hearing their perspective or what they're thinking or you're sharing with them your emotions. Now, again, this is counterintuitive because our first instinct is defend, not let in. But we've got to listen. And remember, we talked about this last week. Listening doesn't just mean you're parroting back what the other person says, or that you're listening to the first sentence and then immediately interrupting to defend yourself or to redirect or whatever else. But that you're listening to them, and especially listening to the emotion underneath what they're saying. Okay, our words carry impact, but what's underneath our words carries more impact. And so, actively, attentively listening. Second thing is benefit of the doubt. Now, it is really interesting to me that a lot of times in conflict, all the things that we talk about that we love with our spouse, we kind of throw them out the window and automatically assume that in some way they're trying to hurt us, rather than just think that, okay, maybe you're just seeing this a little different than me. I want to give you we're going to do a little experiment here to kind of help illustrate this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask, in just a second, I'm going to ask all of you to close your eyes. Now, no cheating here, okay? And then when I say, I'm going to ask the ladies to look at the screen. Then I'll tell you to close your eyes back. Then I'm going to ask the guys to look at the screen. Okay? Sound easy enough? I'm going to walk you through it. Nobody can get lost on this one. All right, everybody close your eyes. No cheating. Everybody's eyes are closed. I'm standing up here in the front and I can see you. So I know if mine are still open. Okay, ladies only. Open your eyes and look at the screen. Okay, now close your eyes back, ladies. All right, guys, open your eyes and look at the screen. Now close your eyes back, guys. Okay, now everybody open your eyes. Turn to the person next to you and say out loud what you saw. Okay? All right, what did you see? You saw a horse, okay? Defend that statement. How do you know you saw a horse? Okay, that's probably the best answer there because I know what a horse looks like. And it looked like a horse. What did you see? A frog. Y'all married? Okay. Are you sure it was a frog? Was it a toad? No, I'm just kidding. I don't know what the difference is between those. Okay, how do you know you saw a frog? Had the shape of what a frog looks like. Okay, well, this is what you saw. Isn't it amazing how sometimes a husband and wife can have the exact same set of facts, but they're looking at it from a different perspective? That's what benefit of the doubt is about. It's about saying if your spouse comes to you and says, I see a horse, they might not be wrong. They might not be seeing what you're seeing, but they might not be wrong. And so part of healthy management of conflict is benefit of the doubt. Environment. And what I mean by that is two things go with environment. One thing is that if you create a good, healthy environment in your relationship intentionally on an ongoing basis, then that's what you want to live in. Okay? You want to live in a healthy environment that's characterized by love, that's characterized by service, that's characterized by forgiveness, that's characterized by blessing each other, encouraging each other, lifting each other up. And just like our thermostat at home, you know, when you're at home and like you're in the perfect temperature, but then suddenly it gets too hot or too cold, we go to the thermostat and adjust it because we don't like to be in that environment that's not comfortable and we know isn't right. Same thing in the marriage relationship is you need to create an environment that, yes, things will still happen, but when those things happen, it's not, this is the environment we live in and we're used to it, so that when something good happens, we don't even know what to do with it. But rather it's living in this environment, and if something happens, it's like, okay, let's get this resolved to get back into this environment that's blessing for both of us. The other thing about environment is, too, controlling the environment in conflict also has to do with where and when you engage conflict, okay? Now, I'm not somebody who ever advocates for a couple like sweeping stuff under the rug, all right? That's not good. That's not healthy. But it's also not necessarily healthy that you create an environment that if something happens in Target, that you're going to hash it out right there in the middle of Target. And it's not a healthy environment ever to marshal the troops and start calling everybody to try to give them your side of the story and tell them why your spouse is wrong. And it's not healthy to do things that are demeaning or embarrassing to your spouse, even if it's just the two of you alone. So creating a healthy environment becomes key. Reaffirming commitment to the relationship. If you have no other ground rule for how you engage in conflict with your spouse, this has got to be the one that is most important. That at the end of that conflict, you reaffirm your commitment to your spouse and to your marriage covenant. Okay? That doesn't mean that you have to kiss and make up. That doesn't even mean that you have to like each other at the moment. But it does mean that you have to let your spouse know, I'm here, and I love you, and I'm not going anywhere. Okay? Now, most important thing about the ground rules is this. The ground rules are internal, not external. And what I mean by that is, whatever ground rules you and your spouse come up with to make that safe zone where you can engage conflict, nobody likes it, but you can still engage conflict and be safe. Whatever rules y'all agree to, you're saying, I will do these, because you can't control the other person. And so the idea is you internalize them and you feed into the marriage from your side, and you just count on that your spouse is going to do the same. And you're probably not going to do it perfectly all the time, but that's what you've got to keep going back to. And I've got one more handout to send around, and what this is basically just a nice little sheet for the ground rules. And on the front of it, there's 7 spaces. I will tell you this, in your ground rules with your spouse, you just need 4, 5, 6, maybe 7 umbrella statements, okay? If your ground rules is a 27-page document with sub-paragraphs and that kind of thing, nah, it'll never work, okay? And the reason that I like something like this, I'm a visual guy. And so what I like is to have something like this on the refrigerator to remind me. Again, this is internal. This is not something you stick on the refrigerator and then in your next argument you go, you broke number 4. You know, none of that, okay? This is internal. On the back side of the sheet are a whole bunch of things to stimulate your thinking about ground rules. Now, you wouldn't want that to be your ground rules. It's too much, okay? But that's what's there to kind of stimulate your thinking about this. So, let me catch up to where I'm at here. The bottom line of what you're asking, what we're talking about with this session is this. What do I need to feel safe? Now, safe is not necessarily happy, but what do I need to do to feel safe when I have conflict with someone I love? And you need to communicate that to your spouse, and you need to hear that from your spouse, so that together you can create that safe environment that we all long for. And they're still coming around. He's getting there. Here's the most significant thing that I'm going to tell you tonight. The absolute worst thing that any of us can ever do is to say or do something in the heat of the moment, and then to come back after that and say, well, I was just angry. You got to understand, I was just angry, as if that's the excuse. Okay, now, don't misunderstand. We all do things in anger that we wish we hadn't done. But our call as Christians is to exhibit Christian character, no matter what the situation. We practice our faith at home first, with our spouse, with our families, then with our church family, then into the larger community. And so, don't let conflict be an excuse for destroying a relationship, because the reality is, and we all know this, once something is said, it's said. We can apologize for it, we can be forgiven for it, but words have power. And so, let's be mindful of our words. Let's build safety in relationships. and again, whether you've been married for 6 months or 60 years, have that conversation. Because if I've been doing something for the last 23 years that's been hurting my wife, if I didn't know that, I'm sorry that I didn't know that, but I do want to know that because I don't want to do it anymore. So, at this time, no, I'm out. That's it. We'll make some copies later. So, hey, if you're married, share with your spouse because you're making these together, right? Okay. If you're not, don't do that. You don't need to have 2 different sets of ground rules, okay? You need to be working on this together. But at this time, we do want to extend the invitation, and we've got the invitation song selected. It's number 894, and if we can help you in any way, come as we stand and sing this song.